This is part 6 in our series in the book of Mark, and we're going to pick up the story right where we left off. Verse 37 of chapter 15. Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. Verse 38. Then the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. There's a lot we don't know for sure about this particular detail. We don't know, for example, if it was the curtain between the holy place and the Holy of Holies, or the curtain that was between the inner courtyard and the holy place. I'll show you a few pictures kind of so you know what I'm talking about. This is a diagram of what we believe Jerusalem looked like in that day. Notice that the Temple Mount dominated the city of Jerusalem. On the Temple Mount, you notice that there's the big open area. This is the court of the Gentiles. That's the part that Jesus had cleaned out earlier. That's where the cellars and all that kind of thing were. And then you'll see Herod's temple in the middle. Now, that looks small compared to the whole Temple Mount, but Herod's temple is actually significantly larger than a football field. So it's a good-sized thing. Notice here I've put the arrow in to show you where that location of that one curtain could possibly be, between the inner courtyard and the holy place, the building that we would think of as perhaps the very temple itself. And then here's another picture. This is a cutaway of the holy place showing a veil that was between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. So we don't know which of those two it was, whether it was a curtain between the inner courtyard and the holy place, or the veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. A lot of people think it's the latter, but we just don't know that for sure. Going right along with that, we don't know for sure how this event became public knowledge, because if it's the inner curtain, that veil, only the priests would have seen it. However, later on, we do know that many priests converted and became Jesus followers, so maybe they're the source of our information. We don't know for sure. Third, we don't know for sure the spiritual significance of this event, of this veil or of this curtain being torn in two from top to bottom. Commentators have speculated that it might refer to God's judgment against the temple and its corrupt leadership, which was a common theme in Mark's gospel, so that's very likely. This tearing of the curtain might indicate the cessation of the temple sacrifices. We're not going to need that anymore because Jesus is sacrificed. Or a new access into God's presence, which is available through Jesus' death. When you read Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 to 22, you see it identifies Jesus' body as the curtain that opens up a new and living way into the presence of God. So any one or more of these ideas might have been in Mark's mind. We don't know for sure which one. What we do know is this. All four gospel accounts include this event, so it's probably significant. That the detail that the curtain was ripped from top to bottom confirms that this was a supernatural event. It wasn't done by a person. And then third, that the ripping had some spiritual significance that was likely understood by those alive at the time. Let's continue. Verse 39. When the centurion who was standing opposite him saw the way that he'd breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." I love the reaction by the centurion. You think about how Mark's gospel begins, the good news of the Son of Jesus, the Son of God. And then here we are, the first person supposedly to state Jesus is the Son of God is this Roman officer. There was something about the way that Jesus died that convinced this hardened Roman military officer, who had likely seen it all, that he had now just seen something new, something remarkable. I love that. If you read ahead, you find out that Jesus comes back to life exactly as he predicted he would. Which leads me to this. If the way that Jesus died convinced a soldier that Jesus is the Son of God, how about the fact that he didn't stay dead? That should be very, very convincing, wouldn't it? Yeah. How trustworthy is a person who can predict their own death and resurrection and then pull it off? How trustworthy is a person who has seen what happens after death, who has experienced the afterlife? How trustworthy is that kind of a person? I was thinking this past week that, back when I was a teen, for whatever reason, I listened to other teens a lot. Teens would just kind of come to me and they would share their problems, and I would often give advice. I do this in person, and sometimes I did it like the really old way, like snail mail. I have a whole bunch of letters of teens asking me for advice when I was a teen. And I like to think, I'm not going to go back and read those letters for sure. I would like to think that the advice I gave them was solid advice. But I'm not convinced that it all was. I mean, because they were speaking to me because I was a teen, and so they believed I could understand them. And I think to a degree I did. I went through a lot of things as a teenager that were hard and challenging, and so it gave me some perspective. It gave me a way to understand and connect with others who were struggling. So I'd like to think that, a lot of my advice was solid, but at the same time, they were asking a teenager. I hadn't lived a ton of life. I'd lived, 16, 17 years is all at that point. There was a lot of perspective I had, but there was a lot of perspective I didn't yet have. I couldn't really give them any solid advice from a parent's perspective, or a pastor's perspective, or the perspective of somebody who's lived and is now at the end of life and looking back and seeing like what really mattered and what didn't, and what will lead you to regret and what will lead you to tremendous joy and gladness that you did that. I didn't have any of that. And that got me thinking about this whole issue of the trustworthiness of Jesus. I mean, who has a better grasp on the meaning of life? A person who's in the middle of it, or a person who has lived, died, experienced the afterlife, and then come back? I think you'd agree with me, it's the latter. Jesus is trustworthy, right? He's got the experience. He's got the perspective. Jesus is the truth-telling, trustworthy Son of God. Let's continue. There were also women watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women followed him and took care of him. Many other women had come up with him to Jerusalem, and when it was already evening, because of the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Sanhedrin who was himself looking forward to the kingdom of God, came and boldly went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised that he was already dead, and so summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had already died. And when he found out from the centurion, he gave the corpse to Joseph. And after he brought some linen cloth, Joseph took him down and wrapped him in the linen. Then he laid him in a tomb cut out of the rock and rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph were watching where he was laid. The release of the body and the burial of the body is solid evidence that Jesus was all dead, right? Not mostly dead, as it jokes about being there in the movie The Princess Bride. Let's continue. Mark 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they could go and anoint him. Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb at sunrise, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb for us?" And looking up, they noticed that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he told them. "You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's risen. He is not here. See the place where they put him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and you'll see him there, just as he told you." They went out and ran from the tomb because trembling and astonishment overwhelmed them, and they said nothing to anyone since they were afraid. I want to talk about a few things from this section. First is the reaction of the women. They came to the tomb expecting to find a body, a corpse. They were met by an angel and given both an unbelievable news and an assignment. That is a lot to take in. When you think this is where you're going to see a corpse and you're going to write, and instead you get this angel, and that's not an everyday thing. That has to really shake you. And then you're told something that's incredible, it's unbelievable, like he came back from the dead. How could this be? We saw him die. What? And then give an assignment. Go tell the disciples this, and right, that's a lot to take in. Mark records that the women, trembling and bewildered, went out and fled from the tomb. Wouldn't you? They needed time to process this experience and to collect their thoughts, so they said nothing. Also, they were afraid. I mean, who would believe them? Jewish law, which was very male-dominated, discounted the witness of women. Yet, good news cannot be contained. And after they'd composed themselves, they did a lot of talking. Friends, Jesus is the truth-telling, trustworthy, risen Son of God. As I think about the resurrection account that we just read, another thing that stands out to me is this is so typical Jesus behavior. It's exactly what you would expect of Jesus. Not what you and I would do, right? But very much what Jesus would do. Three things stand out to me. First, he honored the women who had supported him and stood by him, by having them be the first ones, right? The first ones to get the news. Jesus sent an angel to them, an angel to meet them and give them the news. And then he met with Mary Magdalene personally. Jesus honored these women who had honored him with their finances and then with their presence there at the cross. Second, Jesus expressed his concern for his disciples who had abandoned him, and especially Peter, who had denied him, by having that angel send them a message through these women. That's so typical Jesus, to be concerned about the ones who had mistreated, who had abandoned and denied him. So typical Jesus, isn't it? And then third, we pointed out already that the women were the first ones to get the news, and they were the ones who were appointed to be the witnesses, which is crazy talk, right? Because in those days, the word of a woman wasn't legally binding. It wasn't worth much. But this is the thing that stands out to me. Jesus didn't seem to be concerned about having the most credible and influential people as witnesses. It started out that way. Remember, the good news of Jesus' birth was announced by angels to whom? Shepherds. Shepherds weren't known for being trustworthy, noble people. Jesus didn't seem to be concerned about having the most credible and influential people as witnesses. You saw that at the beginning. You saw it in the middle. He had John the Baptist, a guy who was dressed in camel stuff and ate bugs, right? He had his own disciples who those guys had issues. Friends, that is really great news, that Jesus doesn't seem to be all that concerned about having the most influential people as witnesses, because very few of us fit that description. But that is exactly what we are called to be, witnesses to the risen Jesus and the life change that is ours as a result of that. Typical Jesus behavior. Jesus is the truth-telling, trustworthy, gracious, risen Son of God. Isn't it true? That's what you see in that. His graciousness, his kindness to the women, to his disciples, to us, his witnesses. And finally, I want to talk about the weird ending of the book. It appears, if you've got a Bible, you might see there's a notice here that right after verse 8 says a lot of the earliest manuscripts don't have the rest of it, the appendix. It appears that Mark's gospel ends with the women afraid and telling no one that Jesus is alive. Like that's the end of the book. Now, scholars debate this, and we're going to talk probably a little bit more about this in part 7 of our series, but it appears that this is the end. A couple things on that. First, the weird ending doesn't imply that the resurrection is in doubt. Commentators Wessel and Strauss, I said it really well, so I'm just going to read what they wrote. It must be recognized that for Mark and his readers, the resurrection of Jesus is in no way in doubt. Rather, it was an indisputable historical fact. Jesus himself, the hero of Mark's story and an absolutely trustworthy character throughout the narrative, has 4 times referred explicitly to his own resurrection. Chapter 8, verse 31, chapter 9, verse 31, chapter 10, verse 33, chapter 14, verse 28. Right? So Jesus, who is an incredibly trustworthy character in the story has said, this is what's going to happen. Now, at the end of the gospel, an angel from God, who is an equally trustworthy character in Mark's drama, announces that this prediction has come true. Jesus is risen, chapter 16, verse 6, and his disciples will see him shortly, right? You saw that in verse 7. From Mark's historical perspective, writing in the latter half of the 1st century AD, these resurrection appearances to the disciples that happen after where Mark's gospel may have ended here, they're not rumors or speculation, but indisputable facts of history. Mark's faith, like the faith of his fellow believers, was based on the certain testimony of the apostles and many others who had seen Jesus alive. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. You'll see more on that. The commentators add, a missing page of Codex, if indeed it is missing, cannot silence the testimony of the multitude of eyewitnesses who went on to proclaim the message of hope and salvation throughout the world, that he is risen indeed. I love that. Well said. Second, the weird ending might be intentional. You caught in what the commentators, that bit I just read, they said, a missing piece of Codex, if indeed it is missing, blah, blah, blah. Like I said, there's debate. Did Mark intend to end his gospel this way, or did a part of it get chopped off? We don't know. If it's possible that this is intentional, it might have been done, in fact, for your benefit. Let me explain. Maybe you need to make a decision about Jesus more than you need a tidy ending to the story. Maybe you need to, maybe Mark ends his gospel account with these women and their fear and their decision, like, what do we do now? They're like overwhelmed with all the information and the situation that they're in, and what it'll mean for them to be the witnesses and all that. Maybe you need to be in the same uncomfortable position as the women, having both received the evidence and an assignment to tell others about Jesus. Maybe for you, it's decision time. And so maybe this is intentional. Mark ends it there with the situation that they're in, recognizing that you may be in that same situation, needing to make a decision about the evidence that you've received and the assignment that God is giving you to now go and tell others about Jesus, who he is, what he's like, how Jesus says to live, and the fact that Jesus is risen from the dead. As for myself, I'm convinced that Jesus is the truth-telling, trustworthy, gracious, risen Son of God.